hidden away in a bank account in Qatar. Not the U.S. Treasury, not the Federal Reserve, Qatar. We're talking about a $500 million tranche of cash generated from the sale of seized Venezuelan oil. According to Senator Marco Rubio, $300 million of that money has been distributed, but a staggering $200 million remains parked offshore in the Middle East. And that may only be the beginning. Multiple reports suggest the total value of the seized Venezuelan oil could exceed $2 billion. Democrats are outraged. Congressman Lloyd Doggett is demanding immediate disclosure. Senator Elizabeth Warren is asking the most basic question of all. Is this even lawful? Or has the administration quietly created an off-the-books slush fund that operates beyond the reach of U.S. law? Why Qatar? Who actually controls this account? And with Venezuela facing more than $170 billion in creditor claims, is this a brilliant geopolitical maneuver or a legal time bomb waiting to detonate? Today, we're following the money. We're combing through the transcripts, and we're laying bare what's really happening with the Venezuelan oil billions. To grasp the seriousness of this moment, we have to rewind to what unfolded inside the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on Wednesday, January 28th, 2026. This marked Marco Rubio's first appearance before the committee since the U.S. military operation earlier this year that resulted in Washington taking control of Venezuelan state assets. Officially, the hearing was billed as a discussion on Venezuela's democratic transition, but it didn't take long before the conversation turned to cash. Here's the backdrop. After the U.S. seized Venezuelan state assets, the administration gained control of roughly 50 million barrels of crude oil. At current prices, that oil is worth around $2 billion. That's the stockpile at the center of this controversy. The administration began selling the oil on international markets with the stated goal of funding the interim Venezuelan government in Caracas. The first sale alone brought in about $500 million. During the hearing, senators pressed Rubio on where that money actually went. That's when the revelation dropped. Rubio acknowledged that while $300 million had been routed to approved Venezuelan banks to cover essentials like healthcare, policing, and basic governance, the remaining $200 million was sitting in a Qatari bank account. The exchange that followed was telling. When asked why the funds weren't held in New York or Washington, Rubio explained that the account was deliberately established in Qatar to prevent U.S. creditors from seizing the money. He told the committee it's an account that belongs to Venezuela, but it's subject to U.S. sanctions as a blocking mechanism. We control when the funds are released, not the account itself. That distinction is doing a lot of work. Rubio is framing the U.S. as a mere gatekeeper. Lawmakers, however, aren't convinced. If the U.S. military seized the oil and the U.S. government arranged the sale, how can Washington claim it doesn't control the proceeds? Senator Chris Murphy pushed further, raising concerns about how this looks on the world stage. He argued that the United States is effectively taking oil by force, selling it, and then stashing the money in the Gulf. Murphy asked whether this sets a precedent where America becomes a global repo agent, repossessing assets and warehousing the cash wherever it's most convenient. But the sharpest backlash came from the House. Congressman Lloyd Doggett fired off a formal letter to Secretary Rubio and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Doggett didn't soften his language. He called the arrangement an offshore account outright and demanded to know under what legal authority the administration is acting as custodian of these funds. He asked bluntly why the administration bypassed countries with stronger banking oversight and a track record of transparent oil revenue management. That question sits at the core of this fight. The outrage isn't simply that the money is overseas, it's that it's sitting in a jurisdiction Democrats argue lacks the transparency and congressional oversight that would exist if the funds were held at the Federal Reserve or inside the U.S. Treasury. So why Qatar? To answer that, you have to confront Venezuela's crushing sovereign debt problem. Venezuela owes an estimated $170 billion to creditors around the world. That includes Wall Street bondholders, multinational oil companies like ConocoPhillips and ExxonMobil, whose assets were expropriated years ago, and even foreign governments. If the administration had deposited that $200 million in a New York bank, it almost certainly would have been frozen immediately by court order. Creditors would rush to garnish the funds, and the money would be tied up in litigation for years, completely unusable for stabilizing the country. Rubio's defense is that Qatar offers a neutral buffer. By keeping the funds outside U.S. jurisdiction, the money is theoretically insulated from American court rulings. This kind of workaround isn't unprecedented. After the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the Development Fund for Iraq was held at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, but that fund operated under a UN mandate granting it legal immunity. This time, there is no such mandate. The U.S. is acting alone. According to reporting from outlets like The Independent and Semaphore, administration officials chose Qatar because of its ability to move large sums quickly and securely. But that very flexibility is what alarms watchdog groups. Qatar is a major financial hub, yes, but it also sits beyond direct congressional oversight. Money in the Treasury can be audited. Funds at the Fed leave a paper trail. A commercial account in Doha? That's a different story. Who's auditing the ledgers? Senator Elizabeth Warren has zeroed in on that vulnerability. She has argued there is no legal basis for a president to establish and control an offshore account funded by assets seized through military force. Warren has begun probing major U.S. banks, including J.P. Morgan and Citi, to determine whether they were asked to handle the funds and declined. If U.S. banks walked away due to legal exposure, the pivot to Qatar becomes far more troubling. And remember, the $200 million is just the beginning. The hearing focused on that figure, but the underlying assets are worth 10 times more. The administration still controls roughly 50 million barrels of oil. The initial $500 million sale was only the first tranche. That means another $1.5 to $2 billion could be coming. Where will that money go? If the Qatar account is the template, then billions more may follow the same route, creating what amounts to a massive shadow budget overseen by the State Department and the White House, with sanctions as the only restraint. Doggett's letter raises another uncomfortable issue: corruption. Venezuela's history is littered with looted state funds. Oligarchs and politically connected elites siphoned billions during the Chavez and Maduro eras. Democrats want to know what safeguards exist to prevent history from repeating itself. Rubio testified that the U.S. audits expenditures and requires the interim government to submit monthly budgets. But without an independent auditor in Qatar or Caracas, Congress is being asked to take the administration at its word. Then there's the political risk. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has tried to frame this as a purely technical arrangement, saying, "We're the bankers here, we don't direct the funds." But lawmakers aren't buying that either. Senator Schiff has warned of potential profiteering and is demanding disclosures about whether any senior officials have financial ties to the firms handling these oil sales. So is it legal? That's the question haunting constitutional scholars. The administration is likely relying on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which grants presidents sweeping authority during national emergencies. A Venezuela-related emergency declaration has been in place for years, but regulating commerce is one thing. Seizing sovereign assets, selling them, and warehousing the proceeds in a third country is another entirely. Traditionally, seized assets are frozen until a political settlement is reached. Actively monetizing them and spending the cash usually requires congressional approval. By using the Qatari account, the administration sidesteps Congress's power of the purse and creates a self-financing foreign policy operation. That's why lawmakers like Warren and Doggett are sounding alarms. This isn't only about Venezuela. It's about whether Congress is being cut out of its constitutional role. The custodian argument may not hold up either. If the U.S. decides when and how the money is released, courts could conclude that Washington is the de facto owner. That opens the door to lawsuits from creditors and potentially exposes U.S. taxpayers to liability for Venezuela's debts. Meanwhile, on the ground in Venezuela, the interim government is desperate. The economy is shattered. Oil infrastructure is deteriorating. Rubio insists the funds are essential for humanitarian relief, healthcare, and public safety. Without cash, the transition collapses. He told senators bluntly that progress won't happen overnight, but argued conditions are improving. That $200 million sitting in Qatar is a lifeline. If Congress forces it back into U.S. jurisdiction and creditors seize it, the interim government could be starved of resources. That puts Democrats in a bind. They want accountability, but they don't want to torpedo Venezuela's recovery. It's a high-stakes standoff. So what comes next? First, watch the banks. Senator Warren gave them until January 29th, today, to respond. If major banks confirm they refuse to touch the funds, the pressure intensifies. Second, watch the House Oversight Committee. Congressman Doggett is unlikely to drop this, and subpoenas may follow. Finally, watch the money itself. Does it stay in Doha, or does political heat force a move? And if it moves, do creditors strike? Rubio may have answered a question in that hearing, but in doing so, he may have opened Pandora's box. The secret account is no longer secret, and the fight over Venezuela's oil billions is just getting started. We'll keep following the money. If you want updates as this story unfolds, make sure you're subscribed and notifications are on. Now I want to hear from you. Is the Qatar account a smart shield or a dangerous loophole? Drop your thoughts in the comments.